You know, when I was a child, my great-grandmother lived with us. Rather, we lived with her, since she was older and it was her house. And I was the youngest of 5 children, so let's just say I was a very active child. Not necessarily bad, but creative and curious and a lot of time on my hands, which means I got in trouble a lot. And on one of these occasions, while I was home with Grandma, I got into one of my situations, let's call it, and I exercised a gift that I inherited from my great many times removed grandfather Adam. You know him, he lived in the garden. In other words, I was lying. And Grandma knew it. She knew I was lying, but she couldn't really catch me in it. She didn't know the details, but she knew I was lying about something. And she gave me one of my first lessons on holiness. She said, "Boy, you think you're getting away with this, don't you?" And I looked at her with my most innocent face, and I just knew if I kept my mouth closed, I wouldn't get caught. And she said, "You think you're getting away?" She said, "You may get by, but you never get away. Because there's a God who sits on high and looks down low, and he judges in the affairs of men. And God sees everything you do." And I thought to myself, in my childlike mind, well, that's a secret that me and God's going to keep. But I also learned my first lesson on holiness. But what I learned wrong. See, in my mind, I thought holiness meant God was watching and he was always trying to get me, always trying to trap me. But what I didn't understand in my childlike mind was that I was already trapped. I was already condemned. I was already on my way to hell because I was conceived and brought forth in sin. Romans tells us, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God." Yes, including my very cherubic 5-year-old self was a sinner. And God wasn't trying to get me. He wasn't trying to trap me. His whole idea of holiness was to keep me from being trapped, was to get me out of the mess that I was born into. It's kind of the shades of John chapter 3 when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, and he says that men love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil. And men don't want to come to the light lest they be reproved because they love the sin that they do. And that's where I was. Even at 5 years old, I didn't want to stop doing what I was doing. So in my thought of what I considered, now looking back on the question of holiness, what I was really doing was hiding from God. And what God was doing, even through the voice of my grandmother, was inviting me to let go of my sin and come a little closer to him. Now, let's define, let's see if we can explain what holiness is. We talked about what it's not. We talked about what God's purpose was and was not, but let's talk about what it is. Come on, let's go. Let's walk through the Word and we'll talk a little bit more about holiness. You know, the word holy simply means to be set apart. When it comes to the biblical idea of holiness, we're talking about being set apart for God, something that's set aside for God's purpose and God's use. Now, think of it this way. If something is holy, for instance, my toothbrush is completely holy. I don't even share that with my wife. It's set apart for me. And so when I say that I'm going to be holy, it doesn't mean that I'm going to beat myself up. What it really means is that I'm going to try to love God more. I'm going to give him the first place in my heart. You know, back in the mid-90s, I had the opportunity of ministering with a man who's gone to be with the Lord now. He was, I like to say, small of stature but big of heart, a great man of God, Judson Cornwall. And he and I had been ministering together, and one night after his ministry, he began to talk to me about the concept of holiness. He had preached on this at a church that I had attended, and he talked about how his publisher at the time had commissioned him to write a book on holiness. And for all intents and purposes, Mr. Cornwall had just refused to write it because he had such a problem with the concept. Having been raised in, I think, was Assembly of God's Church, and holiness being just something that was drummed into him from a little child. He started preaching, I think, at age 7. That he had just been resisted this idea because it has been drummed into him about don't do this, don't do that. And he had such a problem with it. And he told me that it was after meditating on 1 Peter 1:16, where the passage says, be holy for I am holy. And after meditating on it and crying out to God about it, is that he remembered, he said, the revelation came to him, for I am holy. You can be holy because I am holy. See, it wasn't about how much he tried to do good or how much he tried not to do bad, like we get caught up in. It was the idea that God was holy and God is the one that made him holy. He came to the revelation, and I hope you're coming to it today, is that he had as little control of him getting saved as he did of him being holy. It was all the grace of God working in him. So he had to surrender himself to the Spirit and to the power of God to keep him. When God is in him, loving the world through him, teaching him how to love God, that's when holiness became the simple action of his life. In the same way that I, loving my wife, am holy unto her because I love her. I don't look at other women. I don't go out looking for opportunities, but I simply get to love her. So it's not about what I can do for God, really. It's about what God has already done for me. When asked this, Jesus said, the great commandment is this, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and then to love your neighbor as yourself. He didn't say don't do this or don't do that or go do this or go do that. What he simply said was love the Father. If you love the Father, then the Spirit of God is working in you, and that is what gives us the ability to separate ourselves from the world. Not the world, but the system of the world. So we're not taking our entertainment in the same way that our unsaved friends. We don't find our joy and our pleasures the same way as our unsaved friends. We don't delight ourselves in the things of the flesh. Starting in I think it's around verse 12, 13 of 1 Peter chapter 1. Peter talks about us turning away from our old life. Turn away from the lust of the flesh, those things that we used to do before we were saved. What makes this happen? The Spirit of God in us. Him loving us and us loving him. That's what gives us the ability to be holy. Come on. Let's walk through the Word. Let's talk some more about being holy. You know, the problem I find when it comes to holiness and the concept of holiness in the Christian church is twofold. One, we either focus on trying not to do enough bad things or so many bad things that God doesn't like us. Or the other thing is we just totally disregard it altogether and we just, whatever. And both of those approaches are wrong. It's not about what we don't do, it's more about what we do. And we can't forget about holiness because the Word tells us to be holy, for God is holy. So we have to come to this other point and we have to say, okay, what is the medium? What is the point where we have to come to? And I think about people like Abraham, Moses, or David, all men who failed God miserably. Abraham, from the very beginning, disobeyed God and took his family with him and wound up going into Egypt and finding Hagar and making the whole Ishmael problem. Moses killed a man and buried him in the sand and then didn't want to circumcise his boys and lost his temper and struck the rock. David, how many faults can we find in him? From adultery to murder to suborning of justice. But all three of these men had one thing in common. They loved God and they pursued God's heart. And they were rated as holy men because they were allowed to come into God's presence, not because of what they didn't do, but because of what they did do. They pursued the heart of God. So if we think about it, Let's go to the last thought on holiness. In the book of Revelation, chapter 22. I think it's verse 11. The angel saying to John, "Let him who is evil be evil still. Let him who is good be good still." And Jesus says, "Because I'm coming back and my reward is with me, and I will reward every man according to his deeds." So why be holy? Why should you and I bother being holy? Because there's a heaven to win and a hell to shun. Because there's a heart of God who loves you and me so much that he sent his only begotten Son, so that whoever would believe in him would not perish, but would have everlasting life. Why be holy? Because living right with God is better than the best day in serving the devil. I remember back when I was in the Marine Corps, and my buddies would go out and I'd go out and I'd go to Bible study and all the wonderful things we did in fellowship, and I would think on Monday morning I'd see them come back and they'd be hungover, they'd be tired and broke. And I would just look at them and I said, how come you are still doing those things when all it does is take? Yet I can go out and do all the things that God has called me to do, come back healthy, refreshed, and still have my paycheck. Serving God is just better. Even if I suffer in this life, I win in the end. Because to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And we do know one thing, that no unholy thing will ever inhabit his presence. So brother, sister, if you would see God, then you must be holy. If you have any questions about what I've said to you today, send me a comment at the bottom of the screen or write me an email at walkthroughtheword@gmail.com. If you have a prayer request, anything I can pray with you and pray for you, we would love to pray and agree with God on your behalf. You know, God loves you and he wants to see you in heaven with him. And that's why he's invited you to be holy. So until next time, continue to walk in the Word and walk with the Spirit of God. God bless you.